Yat Ebene, She Adam Pater, She Tian Englishland, Di Bashichin, Logan Dashache, Navorish Vision Dashanale, Akut Ego, Sun Englishland, Twajala de Nasha. Good morning, everybody. My name is Autumn Platero. I am from Twajala, New Mexico. I am from the Navajo Nation and San Carlos Apache Nation. My major is Native American Studies and my minor is Navajo Language. I am a junior here at UNM, where I am also a part of the Native American Studies Indigenous Research Group. And we have a table over there if you haven't checked it out already. We're doing a silent auction with some very nice jewelry. And we're also holding a raffle. They're $1 a ticket for a door prize. Some really nice pottery. So check that out if you haven't gotten a chance to do that. But for now, I'd like to announce our next presenter, who is an enrolled citizen of the Navajo Nation. She is born for the Twatachini clan and is from Keyence, Arizona. She is an assistant professor of Native American Studies at the University of Mexico here. And her research focuses on political sociology, organizational analysis, American Indian education, and nation building. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Wendy Greyeyes.
She Wendy Greyeyes Twatachini Nishle, do Twatachini Bashichi, is a son of Deshache, Ado Tohana Deshanella, Twatanesha, Dad Nasha. So, my name is Wendy Greyeyes. I'm a second year here at University of New Mexico as an assistant professor. So I grew up in Keyence, Arizona, and obviously I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. But I really want to thank you, Otto, for doing the introduction. Otto actually was one of our participants in our moccasin workshop, so I'm really grateful that I got to know her through the work that she did. But just sitting here listening to the two presenters, Dr. Thorne and Dr. Marley, I kind of looked around the room and really observed that we have a lot of women here. I counted at each of the tables in the room, we have about 80 women and 7 men. I mean, that is just unbelievably impressive. To say that we've made strides in terms of women becoming educated or taking a strong interest in education. I'm very thankful and grateful for every man and woman that is in this room to hear the presenters today. And I hope you take away something that you can hopefully transform what you do at home, what you do at work, but also how you think about your communities. But I also want to especially thank the people who organized this event. As an assistant professor, you're always struggling to find opportunities to put your work out there, find opportunities to do publication. And I cannot say that, this is probably the best job I've ever had. I want to thank Dr. Hade, Dr. Tiffany Lee, Dr. Lloyd Lee, Dr. Robin Minthorn, Dr. Leola Sinigini, Catherine Delia. I also want to thank Paulita Aguilar and Kevin Brown, because there's so many people here that really try to build a community here. And I think Dr. Tiffany Lee said it best. She said, we're here to help create a space and a home for our students. And every day I use that perspective to help guide how I engage with my students. And as someone who worked as a former employee for the federal government, but also for the tribal government, I kind of think a lot about how to soften up those blows from regulations and policies and timesheets and having to engage in terms of working in a very bureaucratic system. And I think this is what motivated my titling for my presentation. to include the term creationism in the title to think about, how are we creating? How are our communities creating? One thing that Dr. Marley brought up was, the dynamics that happen in our tribal communities. We don't think a lot about that. We always think the threat is external, that it's the tribal government versus the federal government. And I also believe that sometimes as nations start to build themselves up, they start to create agendas that really transform what happens in the communities. So my goal in presenting this paper is really about thinking about turning the lens towards our tribal communities and thinking about how our tribal leaders are working with our local communities. So this is kind of where this paper is coming from. But one of the questions that I want to ask the audience actually is, how many people work in tribal government right now? And how many people are educators or teachers that teach in school systems? How many are students? And I think that might be the majority of the folks here. And how many are what you would consider, maybe you label yourself as a local community member? Okay. So this paper is really thinking a lot about the local community. Kind of thinking about how to frame the idea of this notion of tribal nation building. We all talk a lot about how we're working to build ourselves up to address a lot of these issues related to tribal nation building needs. And in thinking about tribal nation needs, one thing that gets missed is actually having a dialogue, a conversation with local community members. And let's see real quick, I need to... So three of the questions that I asked in thinking about tribal nation creationism is, how does tribal creationism, so beautifully imagined and articulated by our tribal leaders, and this happens every election. You have political leaders who come up and give their stump speech, their platforms that talk about, the era of a new dawn, that we're going to bring Pine Sol in and clean up the federal government or the tribal government. And you hear these comments from, tribal leaders who really want to make a difference. They have a vision for the future. And those stories that I hear, I listen to it, and I think they're beautiful creation stories. And I wonder, though, that as they move down that path, they get elected, they get pushed into those bureaucratic walls and systems, eventually those agendas somehow disappear. Those creation stories somehow disappear. And so I ask a lot of these questions as I do this research, is to think about, how do these things become pinned down by bureaucratic realities of red tape? But also, many of these goals are intended to help our people, to change the lives of the community members. But how do they become threats to local communities? Because local communities don't always, buy into what tribal leaders are articulating, and they feel threatened by it. And I wanted to really understand that issue in this process of analyzing this information that I collected. But also, how do we improve our tribal creation projects so that they continue to live and inspire the future? I always believe that our great forefathers, our great grandmothers, built systems to help us. And I don't think they built systems to hurt us or to let these creation stories actually fail. And so I wanted to kind of explore that topic a little bit more in terms of this process. So these are kind of the questions that, were kind of in the back of my mind as I pursued this project. But I wanted to think about, what is creationism? How do Native people, how do Navajos, how do Indigenous people think about creationism. And when I was an undergraduate, I once read Gloria Anzaldúa, and she just completely blew my mind in terms of how she thought about creationism. The way she spoke about it was so raw, and I wanted to share the quote at the top, which states, "I want the freedom to carve and chisel my own face, to staunch the bleeding with ashes, to fashion my own gods out of my entrails. And if going home is denied me, then I will have to stand and claim my space, making a new culture, una cultura mestiza, with my own lumber, my own bricks and mortar, and my own feminist architecture." And when I read that, it just, made everything that I knew as being a Navajo woman, it really put it into perspective. And it made me look back at my home, my community, to think about who are the symbols of our creation stories. And I saw this print by Shanta McGay, this drawing he did of the white child woman holding the two warrior twins. And this print he calls the adoration of the white child. In this story about white child woman, she helped to actually forge the story of helping to create the 4 original clans for the Navajo people. But in the Navajo stories as well, you get the story of creationism that's embedded in someone who was also thinking about the future and planning for the future. So in the story of First Woman, she imagined her goal of strengthening the bonds between the people. And it was through the creation of man and woman. And I put her workers in there because, as you can see, I'm building up to the bureaucratic argument later. But she wanted to take man and woman and build that relationship so that it was unbreakable. Because she knew that the people's life, their legacy, everything that they were as an Indian people was hinged upon that one partnership between man and woman. So she conceptualized that survival of the people would require that depth of their affection and commitment through marriage and children, that she created this goal setting was to empower the people, and therefore she moved with deliberate action and forecasting skills. So, and through this process, we have to think about how our nations move through this process of creationism, and how we actually establish that first kernel, the goal, that seed that actually plants and starts building us towards a pathway towards what we envision as a better society for our Indian people. So, in thinking about these issues of creationism, once you go down a certain path, it's really hard to turn back. So as we move down it, the possibility of returning to tweak, to revise goals diminishes as it becomes harder to turn back. So our dependency on this one path only increases. And therefore, when we are met with an opportunity to craft these goals, that we have to understand what potential outcomes will result. And so when I'm writing and thinking about these issues, I see opportunities in which tribal leaders have that seed in their own hands, that they can forge a future based on that one seed. And I call it a goal. And in this process of moving forward, I envision that, we have to think about how creationism starts with that one seed. In terms of a bureaucratic system, everyone has goals. And we have to think about how goals are being devised in this process. And so this is where I link the idea of creationism to this idea of goal. So the purpose of my study was really to look at how tribal governments think, plan, and create their new designs. So at the root of creationism is the goal. And this is what unifies the people. That the goal is a theory of why change is necessary, and where the division, the department, need or ought to be. And this is a fundamental element within any organization and institution. It's the goal that unifies the workers, the technology, the political will, the capacity, and the social structure. And I have an image that will kind of condense all of this together. But while the goal may spark the engines of change, goals are not independent of their environment. Because they're imagined, they're dreamed, they're developed by the leaders who create those goals. So in the era of self-determination, tribal governments must respond to the social and political demands of its people. Goals become a feature of the expectation of those who create the motivation for the broader participants, but this is where the conflict arises. We have to start thinking about how tribal nations are organizations, that they are driven and actually are packaged into, and this is probably too simplistic, but at least it's a typology to think about how to unpackage the complexity of tribal nations. But why does conflict occur? Why does situations of ineffectiveness occur? Why do projects fail? And it's really thinking about how do we, let's put them into their little pieces and compartmentalize them and think about how tribal nations become these organizations, but they're all driven by different agendas. And here in the literature from sociology, but a lot of historical researchers who do work on developing nations, they talk a lot about roles as one of the primary drivers in an organization. Your social structure, which is really about how people organize and interact and interface with each other. The participants, it's the people there. An organization, a tribal nation can't exist without its people. So when they say participants, that's what binds it together. And the technology, and people think sometimes this is like fiber optic cabling. No, this is what an organization produces. Every organization has a purpose of producing something. A tribal government is supposed to create order. A court system is supposed to, make sure that the laws are interpreted. Schools are supposed to educate kids and ensure that they graduate. So every organization that exists out there, we are bounded to a certain output of some kind, and so technology captures what that output is. And then the environment. For tribal nations, they're struggling with all kinds of political demands, even the political will of the people who are recipients of those organizations, but also funding issues. Funding is determined whether an organization will live or die. And so we think about organizations as a type of organism that it is alive, because we make it alive. We, the people, engage with it and follow the goals, believing we're doing something better for ourselves, but for the people who are receiving the end goals of what we're achieving, that that organization is alive. So we have to think about how tribal nations are fit into this concept of an organization. But it begs the question, what is a tribal nation up against? As they encounter a new grant program, a new legal statute, a new policy from the federal government, a new player like the state getting involved with tribal-federal relationships. Tribal nations are at a moment where they're having to prove their sovereignty, that they're having to legitimize themselves every day, not just to the federal government, not just to the state, but to other tribal nations. What is it now? 567 other tribal nations that they have to legitimize themselves to in order to demonstrate that they are a true sovereign nation. So in the case of this image that I have up here, we talk a lot about the treaties, which help formulate at least and recognize the tribal sovereignty that actually existed before the federal government or even any type of white settlement that occurred within the Americas. I wanted to show you this image which shows the treaty, but also in the image itself you see what the future could conceivably be, which is solar panels, replacing coal, replacing oil, and that's the fate of our future. In my community, they just put in a solar paneling system, and that's supposed to help 7,000 homes in terms of their electricity needs, but also wind power. You guys have seen the wind farms out towards like Holbrook and those areas. Those are kind of cropping up all over the place, as well as what is our future going to be? Are we striving to look like a city? Our former Vice President Rex Lee Jim once said that he wanted to make the Navajo Nation a destination, just like Las Vegas, just like Paris, He wanted to make Navajo a brand in terms of thinking about how to create a better city, a better world for the Navajo Nation. And so by rebranding it and making it to this big city, I always imagined this futuristic vision of what a city looks like at the bottom there. But also science. As you can see, the images of DNA chromosomes. You know, the other day, Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, was asked, you know, why don't you take a DNA test to prove that you're American Indian? I mean, now it's like a big question, is that what our identity is going to be relegated to, is whether or not our DNA and our chromosomes determine if we're fully Native? I mean, there's so many questions about what our future is, and this is the agenda, the challenges that confront our tribal nations. So, and I think the best way to capture that is in an image like this, but never forgetting that the treaties are something that, you know, the Navajo Nation will be honoring after 150 years. So I wanted to kind of put this into perspective. If everybody ran for tribal office tomorrow as a president or a tribal council delegate or something to that level, you would be dealing with a lot of these social issues. And what would be your vision for the nation? So, you know, thinking about what are some of the challenges that confront our tribal leaders, and thinking about these issues is really what the subject of my paper is really thinking about what happens when these tribal leaders are put up to the task of trying to change and address all these issues. You know, what are they bounded by? What is the expectations that we impose upon them, even as community members, upon our leaders? So this is kind of what I wanted to focus on. And I wanted to also entrench it in something that looked just specifically at goals. I know I can look at funding structures, I can look at social structures, etc., but you know, I wanted to first start with the seed of change, and those are usually your goals. So in goals, there's a lot of questions that need to be asked. You know, when you are instituting something, you're always going to get questioned. You know, you're putting an opinion out. People are going to be asking, by whose authority? And I think that's a question that we all ask others, we ask of ourselves. But who's making these decisions? Who will we hold accountable? What are you trying to do in terms of your actions? How will you attempt these actions? What's the political will? Will the tribe benefit or the local community? What's your aim? So what knowledge and skills will this require? And where will these actions occur? Who will be the one doing the work? Are they the technological operators and workers? And finally, who ideally benefits? Who are the recipients? So I think when tribal nations are, you know, confronted with having to make these changes in their nations, these are a lot of questions that they have to respond to and clarify. But you know, when we think about goals, I had to look at some of the literature as well. You know, how goals, there's a huge literature on what type of goals, what goals do. And the top 5 was cognitive goals, which means that the goals can just be, they can just set the direction for the workers, that they can constrain their decision-making and action, meaning you can't do that, you know, or that's not in the policy, that type of thing. So, you know, goals cannot have that cognitive aspect, so it really guides whether you're doing things wrong or right. There's the kinetic goals, which are emotional and motivational properties of goals. You know, it's like, you know, I'm going to go to school and get an education, and the professor, I'm sure it's going to help me empower to be a nation builder. You know, so there's a real emotional feeling about the goal and why you're doing a certain thing. Then there's the symbolic goal, which is like the client or and here I put taxpayers, but these are to help serve and are to create and represent what the allies in the organization that are operating internally and externally. And all that really means is that you feel like you're giving something to the greater good in terms of how you work with your organization. Like I know, like there's the Nest Studies Conference Incorporated. We do conferences every year. Our belief is that we're doing something greater for the Navajo Nation, and that's bringing researchers together to have a place to collaborate exchange knowledge so that we become better thinkers, better researchers, and that's a type of symbolic goal. Justifiable goals are described as, justifying the organization's past actions. And I think this is actually pretty interesting because, sometimes goals have a past tense that, we're trying to address, the deficiencies in our audits. Our goal is to fix our corrective action plan, or to address everything in our corrective action plan. So sometimes goals have that feeling like, oh, we're trying to fix all the wrongs of the past to look forward to a whole new future, hopefully. But sometimes goals have that tone. Then there's the evaluative aspect, which is looking at the behavior or the workers or the entire organization. So sometimes when you're reading and looking at an organization, sometimes their goals are evaluative. Like teachers, sometimes their assessments and the tests that they do, they're guided by how they're evaluated, and so they're not actually concerned about teaching the student, they're concerned about actually, getting a great score on, their evaluations. So, these 5 ideas of goals is just to kind of give you a sense of how complicated, the realm of thinking about goals is. But in a lot of the literature, this work is attributed to Richard Scott, Paul Pearson, and there's a woman named Barbara Charnarski who also writes a lot about the narrative aspect of symbolic goal making. So, thinking about these goal-setting ideas it's a rich literature of information. But how do we connect this to the tribe's the tribal-centric goals? Because in this study, I wanted to keep it very simple. Tribe versus local, central versus local, nation versus community. And so, putting it into this dichotomy, it helps me think about, where does that tension actually occur when tribes establish their goals, when local communities establish their goals. So that's where my analysis is really focused on, is thinking about how each entity establishes its goal, but what type of goal are they articulating? And in this literature, I think, and talk a little bit about how, a tribal nation-centric goal is to really appease to the larger federal and national forces. I mean, that's a lot of what I've seen in terms of tribal nations, because David Wilkins writes a lot about what tribal sovereignty is, and he says, tribal sovereignty has to do, on one hand, with the tribe's right to retain a measure of independence from outside entities, and the power of regulating one's internal affairs, including the ability to make and execute laws, to impose and collect taxes, and to make alliances with other governments. A government will not get into a partnership with a tribal nation if they do not trust them, if they don't believe they can do the work, if they don't feel that the tribe is capable. So this is one of those expectations that a tribal leader enters, and he knows that, or she knows that, as a leader, they have to fulfill these, obligations. And that's what David Wilkins is articulating there. So the pressure for all tribes to ensure their might within the body of 567 competing tribes. I mean, that's right, we're not all unified. We compete for resources at the Department of Interior level. Every time the budget season comes through, fiscal year 2019, what's Trump's budget on, energy or funding certain programs? We all look there, and then the Tribal Interior Budget Committee is supposed to be pushing our agendas and our needs in our communities, but if you've ever been to a TIBIC meeting, you guys will recognize that it's all about, posturing. And, most tribal leaders are given the responsibility of representing a certain region. And sometimes, Navajo Nation is supposed to represent a Southwest region. I mean, he can't represent, or she can't represent the entire tribes, because, Navajo Nation sometimes is just too large, and their needs are different from smaller tribes. So, so there's a lot of pressure within these meetings of tribal leaders to prioritize certain budget elements. But in terms of the pressures there, these tribal nations try to seek out strategies tools and opportunities to establish their power from these sites of powerlessness. So tribal sovereignty force undergirds the way tribal governments relate to their own citizens, to non-Indian residents, to local governments, to the state government, to the federal government, to the corporate world, and now he's adding another layer, and to the global community. So now there's an expectation that every time, Russell Begay goes out to the United Nations and testifies about issues impacting indigenous peoples in the United States, he also has to get validated and verified at the international level. So there's a lot of global demands that are being imposed upon our tribal leaders. So what happens then? What's the consequence of that? Well, local knowledge systems are being compromised. So they're not thinking chapters, they're not thinking local community schools, they're not thinking districts, they're not thinking at the smaller level, they're thinking we have to look big on the world stage. And here I quote the work of James Scott, who writes a lot about the issues related to the state, the challenges of actually seeing like a state, as he titles his book. He says, "The state is the vexed institution that is the ground of both our freedoms and our unfreedoms. Certain states thrive by utopian plans, and an authoritarian disregard for the values, desires, and objections of their subjects are indeed a mortal threat to human well-being. Short of that draconian but all too common situation, we are left to weigh judiciously the benefits of certain state interventions against their costs." So local communities, you got to compromise, is what he's saying. That, when the nation is trying to forge ahead to, bring jobs, to build its economy, to address the healthcare issues, to get everybody educated, sometimes your needs at your local community get compromised, they get squashed by tribal nation objectives. And that's what he's writing about. And the last part of this is, so in thinking about actually creating a typology, and what I mean by that is just the tribal versus local community, I wanted to also think about what has happened in the past. So by taking a very centralized view that tackles elements of creating unification or consolidation as its main operating premise, I think local communities know when they hear the word consolidation or unify or uniformity, some of those are really scary terms for community members because it implies that, their values, their ways of understanding, the ways they want to address issues is just going to get crushed. And so it gets embodied in things like the consolidation of school systems or the establishment of state education agency. So this becomes what James Scott calls a draconian move by tribal nation agents is reflected in these situations. But one story in doing this project was that one tribe described how their elected chairman made the decision to remove local control